red dot, I think, is on. Let's go. We're here to talk about the MPRE, what it is, what it isn't, why we haven't heard anything about it, and how we can succeed. So, Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about why you are qualified to talk about the MPRE?
Yeah, well, I've taken the MPRE. I passed the MPRE, which is also solid. Having already taken the class and such, and having studied for it, I think generally qualifies me, but a lot of people are going to be in the same position, other 3Ls. And it's something that as a 2L and even as a 1L, you need to start thinking about because it's coming up right around the corner. We spend a lot of time talking about the bar exam, but to be able to take the bar exam, you need to have passed the MPRE first. So it's pretty important to have that consideration.
That seems like maybe something we should have already heard about then. But so what is the MPRE?
Yeah, so the MPRE is a test that is 60 questions long. Something I wish I knew closer, not as close to this date that I was taking it, is that it's only 50 of those questions that are graded. You get 10 questions that are kind of a test. You got to be a guinea pig for those 10 questions, but it's about pretty much all the model rules of professional conduct. And it also includes the rules, the conduct for judicial conduct. So it's not just what you need to do as an attorney and what you need to keep in mind, but also for judges. I don't recall in my class with Professor Eldred, or I don't think Professor Sorensen's class touches on it as much for judicial conduct. And when you get to that point in whatever study method you're using, it's a little confusing, but it's going to be the rules of professional conduct for lawyers and then also for judicial conduct. That's going to range from things that, you know, most of us have already heard about conflicts of interest, but it's also going to include how can you accept client money? What if a client wants to terminate you? How does that go about? And what judges can do as well. So some of the questions for judges, if you're a judge or if you know somebody who's a judge, what can they do? What can they not do? What can they accept? What do they have to deny? All sort of that.
Got it. Great. I'm really excited. All I know so far is don't sleep with your client. So hopefully
You,
there's
there are exceptions. There are exceptions.
Okay, so when did you take it?
I took mine in October this past year. So there's generally about 3 exams each year. Obviously, with COVID-19, that's kind of impacts some of it. But you can either take the exam, especially if you're a 2L considering it, you can take it in March, you can take it in August, and then I think instead of an October date, it's going to be a November date for 2021.
Something I was surprised when I was looking into this was that the exams are in person still. Like you go to like a testing center and you're on a computer.
Yeah.
Um, where so in October, I can't remember. October was that was during COVID, right?
Yeah.
Like
No,
masks and everything. Okay.
literally just a few months ago.
Okay.
So
All right.
time is hard to tell in a pandemic, but it is confusing because when you do go on the website to register for the MPRE and then to kind of get more information of the MPRE, there are options that make it seem like, oh, if I was taking it at home, the mask mandate doesn't really apply because I'm in my own house. But for the most part, the exams are in person. It's going to vary at the amount of space that you have between for each testing facility, because even if they're all under Pearson or under some other testing, it's going to be different for every building. But at least when I took mine, they had us going in kind of piece by piece, not all at once, sending people off to one room, sending people off to another room. And you can tell that obviously under other circumstances, every single desk would be filled. But at least at this point, there is some space in between. But if you're feeling a little stressed out more than usual because of COVID-19, that is an added stress that for whatever reason, they haven't really considered to not do that. So that is something to consider going in, is that you will be in person, and depending on how you feel about the pandemic, that could also trigger some stress.
So the upcoming registration deadline is January 28th, which is next Thursday.
Yes.
And one of the things I thought was pretty alarming was the accommodation timeline. So they
Yes.
recommended that you submit January 4th, which for people doing math at home was weeks ago. Um, did you need an accommodation if you want to talk about it for your exam? I love all the resources that you put together, but did you need to go through that process? Did you know people who did, and what did
So
that
I
look like?
didn't have to request an accommodation. When you had asked me about it and I was like, oh, there's a whole process that regardless of whether I need to personally ask for an accommodation, that's something that's one really good to know. And generally how you request accommodations here goes into other facets, like, if you're an employer or an employee asking for an accommodation. So it's just generally good things to know. But it is, I would agree, it is alarming how quickly, when you think about taking the exam, how quickly you want to get that accommodation request in, just because on the website, as you're looking through, if you're not even really reading through every single line, if your papers for requesting an accommodation go in after the deadline, they might not even look at it. And if you really do need that accommodation, it becomes really tricky. What I think might be an issue going forward, just as I was putting this together, thinking about it, there are a lot of people that might not have needed to request an accommodation previously, but with the long lasting effects we're seeing some people have getting sick, you might need to request an accommodation. And one part of the application is when you're asking to get an accommodation for the MPRE, what have your other accommodations requests look like? Were they approved? But if this is your first time asking for an accommodation, it's going to be really hard because you're not going to have that previous documentation. You might have some medical documentation. And even though the personal narrative part of the accommodation application is optional, that ends up being the more important part, or the most important part, because you can really articulate there why you should be given an accommodation. With the timeline as well, the website is very clear in saying that they go around 25 business days to consider your accommodation request. And so if you can wait because you know that you want to get an accommodation, it almost might be better to wait until an August test date or a November test date. Because as long as you get the MPRE done before you need to sit down for the bar, or if you need to retake it, if you're not satisfied with your score, you do have some time with it. But if you need an accommodation, you might want to wait, which is terrible.
Yeah, I was also thinking about this more highly contagious variant, right? That is starting to pop up in some areas. And so I myself have been weighing, do I want to try and get this test over before that variant hits the Boston area, or do I want to wait and take it like not during class? So even if I do get sick, like it's just in the middle of the summer and it's not going to impact anything. How did you weigh your decision to take it in October?
Well, for the March deadline, I thought about doing it right then and there because if you're taking the class kind of concurrently, the material is more fresh in your brain. But I missed that deadline. So that was not an option for me. And for August, I think it was also just with everything going on in the summer, I decided not to do it in August and wanted to do it in October. So there is part of that consideration as well, as a side note, that if you know how well you study and you want to do a test when the material is the freshest in your brain, that March date might be really good because then you get it out of the way. You don't even have to worry about it. All the other things that can pile up in 3L, you've already got the MPRE out of the way. But if you don't want to really have that consideration and you're concerned about, what's the situation going to look like now versus sometime later in the year, it might be better to do it then. I missed the first deadline and then I decided I might as well just take a little bit more time for it. But and that just happens. Sometimes you think that there's a deadline that comes up and then you just miss it. Just, not for court things.
Did you miss the deadline because the school was slow to inform you of these upcoming test dates, perhaps?
There were some times that you would get an email that'd be like, here's another date coming up. But sometimes if we did get an email, like once you get closer to the test dates, coach does send out a few more things closer to then, but it's more oriented towards like, you've already registered. Here's what you could do. And it was more figuring it out on my own, like, oh, this is when I need to register for it. Or, especially whether you forget about it or whether registering for a test is something that causes great anxiety, which for most of us it does, we tend to push things off a little bit to the end. And one of the annoying things with the MPRE registration is that when you first create an account, it's about a 24-hour waiting period for it to actually become active. So if it's the day before and you're like, I need to register for this, I need to do all of it, your account is probably not going to be created in time for you to actually be able to register for it. So even just creating the account early, whether or not you decide to register for March or register for later, you'll already have that account created so that you can just register for it when you actually feel ready for it.
Got it. So we register in the little blurble I shared, the NCBE, the National Council of Bar Examiners, I'm guessing. That's the registration link right there so that everyone can go ahead and make their account. Make sure you can get to that January 28th deadline if you decide you want to take it in. I'm always surprised by how far in advance you schedule things out. Um, I, I'm sure there's a reason and a rationale, but it's like thinking about taking this in March. I have no idea what my life is going to look like in March. So again, I'm still well in the middle of my whole what should I consider? What's my life going to be like? I'll probably just end up taking it to get it over with. Quite frankly, that seems like something I would do. So how did you prepare for this exam? Because from my conversations, it seems like the professors who teach us ethics, which is related to some of these topics, they specifically do not teach to what we are going to be tested on this exam.
It's a little bit tricky with that because I know when I was in my ethics class and our semester was half of it in person and then pandemic quarantine. So my experience with ethics as a whole class is a little bit different just because we had that sharp break in the middle. In terms of studying for it, I was told very clearly in my class, this is not going to prepare you for the MPRE, which is frustrating. But in terms of preparing for it, I think for myself, but for others, if you can take practice exams to be able to just see what the questions are going to look like, that's really, really helpful. And obviously, some people feel really good with practice exams. Some people, it stresses them out. It's not their thing. But even just to get a feel for what those questions are going to look like. Some of the preparation materials, whether you're going with Barbary, whether you're going with Famous, whichever one you're going with, they tend to be a little bit harder than the actual exam. So I know when I was going through my questions, I felt like an absolute idiot because I would look at a question, I'd look at the answer, and it would be a struggle because it's like, well, what am I getting wrong? But when I actually went to do my test, it was still kind of difficult. There were some questions that really threw you in for a loop, or you looked at a question and you realized this is a section for like conflicts of interest or some other section that I completely looked over. But for the most part, the questions aren't quite as bad on the exam. And that's obviously going to vary with each individual person. I found for myself doing practice questions and practice exams, going back over, writing specifically the things that I got wrong, that really helped. And then by the time that it got closer to the exam date, I didn't want to do any practice exams just before that because I was going to have to sit for an exam anyway. And I would just find, I think I had a Famous book, whichever one you're looking at, they tend to have outlines that you can either rip out or you can just refer to online. Going back over those sections again, not so much with like doing practice questions, but just looking back over those text topics and saying, okay, this is what I need to remember. This is what I need to remember. One thing I think is important to distinguish that I wish I would have done sooner is whether you're in the ethics class or you're taking the MPRE, there are a lot of rules that have a distinction as things you may do as an attorney. So if something happens, you may report this. And then there are other rules that are explicit. You must do this. And then there's a third category of things that you're prohibited from doing. So one of the examples for the last one is if you're somebody who's hired to investigate a company, the company themselves are hiring you to do the investigation. If you find something kind of shady, you can't report that out because you were somebody hired by the company. So that's something that explicitly is a prohibition. So knowing within the rules, the things that are permissive, things that are kind of a little bit more flexible, and the things that are concrete that are you must or you cannot. That's something I wish I would have looked into sooner. And as you're going into the class, even though the class, the way you study for it and the way you study for the exam don't always mesh up very well, knowing those distinctions can be helpful in your studying for the MPRE as well.
I'm so glad we're talking about this now because that I've been thinking about what kind of a framework can I use when we go into ethics. And I think I'm going to try. I think I'm going to try this. You say may, must, and outright prohibitions. I like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like what's permissive and what's an obligation.
Got it. So I feel like we've done a nice kind of overview about what it is, what to consider, when to register, how to get ready for it. Again, in the resources, right? I've got the links to the NCBE, to Pearson View, so that you can locate a testing center. I've got a link there to one of the testing centers in Boston, so that you can kind of see um, like prohibited items and all that crap that you need to know. I found a bunch of the different preparation resources, which it seems like that all of the bar prep companies provide a free MPRE resource. So also, if you haven't considered um, a bar prep company, this might be like a good tester. Like, how do you engage with their MPRE materials might inform how you, like if you decide to purchase one of them. I don't know. Are you using a bar prep company? Are you free forming your bar prep?
I am doing a bar prep just because I know that once I get to the end of it, when I am studying, I do want to have something that's a little bit more guided. So like even so I decided to go with Barbary. And again, this is not telling anybody what to choose. This is just my own experience. Um, but one of the things that I liked about it when I was going on it is, and it could be something that varies between each one as well, is that you can get ones that are kind of, you know, that you are on top of yourself. You do not need somebody else on top of you telling you to do work. And then there are other formats where you have something that's constantly reminding you like, hey, you need to be on top of it. Kind of the overall note with that, and then the MPRE in general, and just studying in general, like know what suits you very well for studying. I think especially in 1L and coming into 2L as well, there's a lot of pressure of like, this person's doing one thing that seems to be working really well for them. Maybe I have to change everything in what I do. And that could work. You know, you could find another study method that you hadn't thought of previously. But if you know something works really well for you, like, no, trust your gut that that is something that works for you. It's interesting that a lot of the MPRE materials are offered for free, because I wish that was the same for bar prep materials. It seems a little ridiculous. Um, but having those exams, or even a lot of them will at least provide material, like the actual outlines for it as well. And going back over those sections can be really helpful, even just um, for the ethics class. Like I definitely remember there were some sections where it's like, I don't understand this. I'm listening to the professor, but it's a foreign language to me right now. Even having those references aside can really help you to understand what those rules are. Even for the class itself, I think buying the supplement, I kind of wish I would have done it. I was being really cheap and I didn't want to buy it. But you can either do the supplement for the class, or the rules are on the ABA website as well. So there's a lot of ways to be able to see the actual text of those rules without having to spend, aside from the MPRE materials.
Great, awesome, love it. Aggie or Fernaz, do you have any questions for our MPRE expert and successful passer?
I first have a comment because I looked ahead as I do to the March dates, and those are during school. It's a Monday and a Tuesday, which is really annoying. So just a side note, I was like trying to decide if I wanted to do it maybe in March, maybe in August, and I'm like, well, I have like I would miss all of my classes early that week. So um, just wanted to point that out.
That's a good
But
consideration.
what?
That's a good consideration, because I know for my October test, I think I took the test early enough in the day where I could still go to class, but depending on your class schedule between those 2 days, you could run into that issue as well.
Yeah. So I don't know, that doesn't rule out March, but it's something I know I wanted to think about.
Yeah.
How much time, effort, I'm trying to decide if studying for the MPRE is something like I would prefer to take it earlier while I'm taking ethics, just to like help to reinforce that information. But I already have all my classes. Like, do I want to also study for the MPRE? How much effort is that realistically?
Yeah, so I definitely think, depending on how quickly or how far in advance you register for the exam, anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, I think is more than enough. For some people, if you're feeling really stressed, you might want to extend more time, but going through the material, you can go through it within a shorter amount of time. But if you have a stacked schedule, I know both my 2L semesters were pretty stacked, and I think that was actually one of the reasons why as well I decided to push it back a little bit. I know for mine, because I think I registered I think by the time I registered and then I needed to start studying, I had just over 2 weeks to study. And so that was more of a concrete, like every single day I had something I was doing. I was either taking a practice exam, going through the modules, like I had something done for each day. It seems more intimidating, but it is pretty manageable. And I know I say that as somebody who sometimes is very terrible at scheduling things to do like that. Um, it is manageable. It can feel very stressful. And I think part of it is speaking for some of the other programs. So either with Barbary or Thamus, some of the questions really do feel that hard. And if you're kind of struggling with the material, it adds on to that pressure of studying. But I do think genuinely the prep materials are significantly harder than the questions you'll see.
Okay.
And so it does help a little bit. It's stressful because I know we were all talking with each other, like, I'm doing my prep. I feel stupid. Like, what am I doing right now? But 2 to 4 weeks, I think, as a timeline. Two, if you don't have a lot of time, like, I wouldn't go less than two. That you could, but that's just not, you're not going to have a fun time with it.
Yeah.
4 would be a little bit more spread out to be able to have, like, I want to do the modules for whatever thing I'm looking at, or just looking at the material, do practice tests, do practice questions, or you could just forego the modules and just do practice exams as well.
Okay.
I know that when I was doing it, I think I was doing mine through Barbary. They had all the modules set up first, and then, so it was a nice review for me because having taken it or studying in October, I forgot a lot of the material. So it was nice to kind of get a refresher and then start to take the practice exams. But if you're taking it now in March, if you're already kind of going through the material, that might make more reason to just go into a practice exam first, see how you're doing with that, and then go into the modules.
Okay. Cool.
I hope that answered it. I feel like that was kind of all around the place.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. I've never zoomed in from my phone. My question is, the questions, all 60 of them are going to be multiple choice, right?
Yes.
Okay, so no short answers or essays.
There are no short answers. It is, instead of even like the A through E, you only get 4 choices. So it's even more black and white answers, which, especially considering all the things you've learned through law school of like, it depends, there's a gray spot. The MPRE is not like that. Some of the rules are going to be really specific as like, you can absolutely do this or you can absolutely not do this. And then some will be like, it's like almost wartime flashbacks to the LSAT of like, this is kind of a better question. This is kind of it, but it's only 4 options for each multiple choice.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah. And kind of on that note, actually, one of the things that I wanted to put in the outline and kind of say as well is that regardless of what your personal ethics and values are, the ethical rules don't always reflect that. If you're somebody who is more social justice oriented or public interest oriented, a lot of the ethical rules are going to be a struggle. And it's really hard with the multiple choice questions as well, because you only have 4 choices. And so there's almost having to put that aside as you're studying, which is really frustrating. But I know for myself, I've already been doing that through the law school experience for all of my other classes. So ethics as the class and then the MPRE exam, it's kind of another layer of, these are what the rules are. This is what it's telling me is ethical. That doesn't necessarily apply outside of this exam. Or if I don't get as high of a grade as I wanted, that numerical attachment, that grade, is not an indicator of what my own ethics and values are.
Thank you.
Questions I just thought of. So for as long as you pass, is there a reason why you would want to retake it? Like, is there a reason why you might want a higher score, like with the LSAT or something?
No.
Or is it like, okay.
No.
Then there
Pretty
is,
much all you need with the MPRE is to be able to sit for your exam wherever you're taking it, whether it's with a UBE state or if it's another state that hasn't adopted the UBE. You just need to get the score required. So I know for mass, it's 85.
Hmm.
And there's also a little bit of a curve as well. So it's hard to kind of gauge, especially when you're taking the practice exams. Sometimes it'll be like, well, how does this mean for my test? How does that necessarily translate? But there is a little bit added because 10 of those questions aren't actually being graded.
Okay. And then so you get just like one raw score basically, and as long as you hit it, because I'm still struggling as to where I may end up practice. Like I don't know yet where I'm going to sit for the bar, so I might be shooting for 85. I might be shooting for something else. Is it just
Yeah.
like as long as I get probably good enough across the states I'm interested in, that
Yeah.
seems like the way
So
to
that was something I actually was looking at. The site has a whole map of where you're looking at, and most states fall within 80 to 85, whether or not they're UBE. So like Florida, for example, was one I was looking at, not because I want to take it in Florida, but from Florida. Florida's 80. Massachusetts, New York, and Texas, as of right now, are 85. DC, interestingly, is a little bit lower. So
Mhm.
80 to 85 tends to be kind of a baseline, but if you have jurisdictions that you're interested in, definitely keep them in mind, but they tend to have an overlap. So if you go well above that grade, whether it's 80, whether it's 85, you should be pretty set for most states, but it is going to depend if there is a different score for that state as well.
Okay, cool.
But as long as you hit that baseline, you should be good for most states.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm again just so thankful that you would share your brilliance and expertise with us and take some time today to go through the MPRE and ins and outs. Uh, uh, I don't have any other questions. I see muted microphones from our participants, so unless anyone has something else, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.